Numerous reports indicate that manufacturing has emerged as the favorite target of ransomware groups and hackers. In response, a new report from Industrial Media discusses the evolution of industrial cybersecurity, its current state, and the tactics hackers are using, including phishing schemes, malware, and ransomware attacks. It also details solutions in arming manufacturers with the knowledge and resources needed to win more fights on this highly complex and ultra-competitive battlefield. Download the industrial sector's new battlefield by going to manufacturing.net/cyber. Hi, I'm Jeff Ranke, Editorial Director of Manufacturing.net and Manufacturing Business Technology. Welcome to Security Breach. Cyber attacks can share a number of similarities in terms of the target, type of attack, the vulnerability being exploited, or even the black hat's tools of choice. However, going a step further, I personally see two common elements of a hacker strategy that show up regardless of whether it's a ransomware attack on a local healthcare system or a malware drop on a global automotive manufacturer. The first is speed. Once an exploit is detected by the bad guys, they're going to work as quickly as possible to take advantage of it, hopefully beating the deployment of any patches. Speed also comes into play once the hack has been launched and trying to steal as much data, do as much damage, or extort as much cash as possible. The second element is manipulation. Most commonly, hackers take advantage of well-established systems that have unextraordinary access points, legacy connections, or human management dynamics that are easily manipulated by altering software code, stealing login data, or introducing malware. Based on these fundamental dynamics, it would seem that hackers could benefit greatly from a tool that reduces a human being's grunt work and utilizes algorithms and automation to reproduce or to produce the text for a phishing email, to rewrite software code for penetrating firewalls, or to develop data mining protocols to obtain more personal information. That tool is obviously artificial intelligence, and the hackers are all too familiar on how to use AI platforms for their nefarious purposes. Fortunately, the good guys have also become well-schooled in the art of AI, and we're about to hear from one of them. We're excited to announce that this episode of Security Breach is being sponsored by Palo Alto Networks. Protect your OT assets, networks, and remote operations with Zero Trust OT security, powered by AI and machine learning while offering comprehensive visibility, Zero Trust security for all OT environments, and simplified operations. For more information, please visit www.paloaltonetworks.com/network-security. We're excited to have Gary Southwell on the show. He's the VP and General Manager at ARIAS Cybersecurity, a leading provider of AI-driven detection and response solutions for the OT environment. Gary, thanks so much for joining us, and welcome to Security Breach. And starting out a little bit, I'd just like to get your perspective on maybe some of the changes you've seen specific to OT cybersecurity over maybe the last 2 or 3 years. There's obviously been a ramp up in attacks, more notoriety around surrounding some of these attacks. How has that impacted things, either just from the general landscape perspective or things that you see day to day?
More recently now, as you say, there's been a realization that just trying to wall OT off from the outside world isn't really working. And a lot of these attacks, and probably the one that kind of got this nation's attention was the Colonial Pipeline. And it's kind of like after Colonial Pipeline, suddenly the government was involved, and started to ask the harder questions, which they hadn't been for a while. So there really was, oh, you know what? We need more governance from IT over OT. We just can't let these guys do their own thing anymore. And that's good and bad. So, yeah. Good is you get governance. You got people from the IT side saying, yeah, I understand cyber attacks. I understand how to monitor endpoints and applications, where the OT guys were like, yeah, I don't do that. I just try to keep the plant running as long as we can and then do any patches or updates, once a year when we have factory shutdown. It's kind of like, and they're like, no, we're going to use more of the traditional IT methods here. So that's created a lot of challenges and disruption. And I'll say one of the areas, the attack vectors, people kind of miss. They keep thinking, well, it's the internet. It's not really the internet so much. I would say the biggest attack vector is typically coming in from trusted suppliers, into those OT environments. They're here to do updates. They're here to do checks. They're here to keep things running. And you're only as safe as their devices, instrumentation they're bringing into your environment. So it's not just the wide open internet. But as you integrate IT and they're trying to bring in their processes, now you've broken that barrier, which was, hey, there's no way for the bad guys to get in. And suddenly IT is this new vector in addition to suppliers. So that's what's really complicated things. And that's why I think you're seeing more of a variety of attacks. You're seeing a lot more malware and ransomware suddenly landing in these environments where it was difficult for them to gain purchase before.
So are you seeing, when we've talked about this before, others have brought it up as well, kind of trying to bring some of those IT practices into the OT environment, which is awkward. It's not a real cut and paste dynamic. It doesn't work out well. But are we seeing more of those siloed approaches to security between IT and OT being broken down? Are you seeing them working together more and better right now than maybe even 18 months ago?
I'm going to give it a mixed bag. It really depends on the organizations. You hear a lot of frustration from the OT guys that the IT guys just don't understand, what they're trying to do, and they're like, they just don't get it. And some of these are very, very large firms, where you see that they're like, I can't continuously patch, So that's usually the number one thing IT guys are like, okay, the Bible says patch as frequently as you can, right? And we're going to come back to that in a second, because what are you patching? They're in agreement on the network. Like, let's have adequate firewalling, let's have adequate protections there. Let's understand what's in the environment so that we know what's there to protect. So that's where the good part of ITs come in. But then it's the process and how do you deal with this? And then compounded on top of that, there's new rules that are coming in, from the Homeland Security, for instance, crossing a lot of industries, or from the cyber insurers themselves saying, okay, we're going to tighten things up here, or else you can't get renewal. You even got on utilities. NERCSIP is, starting to really get active in, expanding the monitoring of endpoints in the OT environments. So that's really where it's coming right down to. So if I look at it, I'll say it's kind of an incomplete. IT is trying to come in with good governance, and now they're having to learn and react to the OT environment and the constraints around that. And do they want to break those constraints and legislate a wholesale, hey, it's just an IT environment into the factory, or is there a hybrid? Then how do we deal with that?
Sure.
Where we maybe don't patch as often as we want, and how do we make sure we have compliance? And then added to all this is the SEC's new directives. So, we could talk about that in another question here, but there's quite a bit going on there. I would say that's kind of incomplete, but it's creating an opportunity for vendors like us. We think we have some, interesting solutions to help solve some of these problems.
Well, you brought up an interesting point as well in talking about a lot of this new technology that was brought into the facilities, and that brings up a lot of conversations in terms of secure by design by a lot of those components and systems that are being integrated with legacy systems. What is your perspective there? Is the onus on the individuals who are purchasing, the firms that are purchasing that equipment, to make sure everything's turned on? Is it a greater emphasis on the supplier, making sure they're bringing in things that have security protocols in place? I guess, where does the onus lie, in your opinion?
It always is going to lie on the purchaser, right? They're the ones. I mean, the suppliers will pretty much come in and say, well, I've got all these capabilities. What do you want? In some cases, it's a mixed bag. You look at the industrial automation guys; they've got a lot of things that they'll recommend, but then with the IT guy or the OT guy, in this case, usually is saying, well, can I adopt that? Can I run that in this environment? What's the implication of that? As I mentioned before, a lot of these environments still have old assets, right? So they'll be running things like, machines that have 10-year-old, Windows environments. Some may actually go back to Windows XP, right? Because it was just easy to leave in place. And they're like, oh yeah, but that's only 10% of them. But that happens to be where all the production applications fail if those 10% go down, right? So that ends up becoming a linchpin. So like if you come in with an automation solution, so, oh yeah, do this, do this, do this. And they're like, that endpoint can't deal with that. If you're going to run all those hooks and whistles on that thing, that'll crush it. There's not enough processing power. So then upgrade it, in which these automation guys are happy to see you upgrade, but they're like, okay, now I got a plan for that. And then I can do that once a year, and that may be millions of dollars, a lot of these operations aren't willing to do that because it's a huge task. And I think there's getting more onus to move forward now because of the potential scrutiny that's now coming on the line. But it's been a real fight in the past to get those things approved.
understandably, in production facility, that downtime or the potential downtime is always a big sticking point. And we've seen in a lot of instances that is creating new vulnerabilities for hackers to exploit. Are you seeing a similar dynamic, or what are the areas where you're seeing as maybe the softest spots in some of these OT environments?
That goes, if I step back for a second, I'm going to go back to the original approaches. So most of the OT environments, there was, I call it firewalling. Some people would say it's the Purdue model, where you've got layers of defense, but they're layers of network defense for the most part. What do I allow to communicate, within this environment? I've got this, level 2, level 3, level 4, and then, IT's usually out in the level 4 area if you're using the Purdue model, and all is good there. And then occasionally they come in through proxies and, pull up data. And often it's just one way, so just pulling it up for their SIMs to keep on monitoring everything, and that's fine. But now what people are realizing is, because we keep mentioning one thing over and over again, is vulnerabilities. Are vulnerabilities in the network? No, vulnerabilities are in applications. Do applications run on a network? Well, for the most part, no, they run on the endpoints. And that's where there's been a real lack of protection on these devices. You go in there and you're like, well, what are you running on your endpoint? And you're like, least amount possible. It's usually the answer. If I'm running, stuff from like Windows 10 onwards, the latest, server, 2019 or whatever, they come with things like Windows Defender, right? And then that's the baseline I'll be running. And even that, they're a little bit worried about it because it can still cause issues with their production applications. So they now have to go in and monitor this thing and make sure it works. Now, if they're running anything older, Windows Defender isn't available. So they're basically running nothing, when you got to Windows 7 backwards. And, we've gone into one pharmaceutical, like, what do you got? And 70% of their stuff was Windows 7 or older, in their OT environment. So I'm just picking on one just to make it a point that it doesn't always have to be just these old legacy devices that are over here in the corner. You may be running your whole production facility on old stuff. Which didn't seem that old when they were trying to sweat assets for 15 years, right? So the point really is the challenge right now, I think, and the way the attackers are going after it is, if we can take advantage of application vulnerabilities to exploit the applications, that's the surface that generates, the biggest bang for the buck, because that's where everything's running. That's where I can actually, if I can get in there, either I can disrupt the application, I can gain control of it, and I may actually be able to export, in-string information out of the application. So that to us is the frontier, that has to be addressed.
Well, and that's interesting because a lot of times when we talk about the OT environment, we look about endpoints, connection points, API calls, and things like that. Whereas what you're talking about is sort of a blocking and tackling, or one of the low-hanging fruits, really, when it comes to security, along with logins and things of that nature. It's interesting to see how that's sort of coming full circle a little bit.
Right. Yeah. What people have kind of ignored is that, I've got PLCs, I got these other, interesting pieces of hardware, they really can't be attacked that well. And I'm like, no, the industry automation guys have opened these things up so that they can do a better job of doing updates. Often these things are running in conjunction with a server on top of them that facilitates the use in these manufacturing environments. So things aren't like they were completely 20 years ago. So you've got these, I've got Windows, I've got Linux, I've got it running in the factory. It's not just some ancient version of VxWorks on a PLC over here. And I hope that the attackers don't know how to attack VxWorks. So that's my defense. And all I got to worry about is API calls, because those are going up to the open environment. If I can keep those controlled, everything's good. But again, you're trying to protect yourself from the outside world. And then all of a sudden here comes, your industrial automation it's got a contractor come in and say, hey, it's time to do your update on your application. We've detected performance issues here. Oh, yeah, I want that. And all of a sudden he introduces some form of malware, ransomware, or some other form of, and that just gets right by all those defenses that you put in place. And we're like, no, I don't see no evil here, no evil. It blows these people away, right? And we've seen a string of those more recently starting to come to light. And then there's the challenge there, if you let me go on, is that, I don't want to pick on the industrial automation guys because they got big, huge suites of applications. But, if they get notified there's a vulnerability, it can take them months some cases 6 months to come up with a patch. That's an awful long time to be exposed. And then you've got to take the patch, and then you probably want to test that because, wait a minute, this is a brand new version of my industrial automation, which is, if it doesn't work right, this thing shuts down. So you're going to test in your engineering devices, make sure it works, and then port it over. So that might take a month, right? So you've now gone more than half a year being exposed. So that to us is like, in the new environment, that's not going to cut it any longer, So we think the trend is to automate the heck out of the tools. So the tools do all the work, and the tools will run, the tools will monitor, the tools will tell you when something's wrong. The tools will help you be in compliance with, the SEC's guidelines, where you've got to come back in 4 hours and 4 hours, I wish 4 days, and tell them you've breached. And then, God forbid, you don't tell them you actually solved the problem in those 4 hours, because now you've got to disclose that again and again inside these documents if you're a public company, and no one wants that, right? But that just changed the whole rules, right? I was like, wait a minute, yeah, I was breached. I'm waiting for a patch from, vendor XYZ, it'll be down in 3 months. That's an event that's now in your, report, and people are going to see that, and they're going to say, is that material to your business? And if one of your lines is down, it's probably material to your business, for these manufacturers. So that's the real challenge. So I can't speak for others. So what we did is we looked at it and said, how do we figure out what attacks look like and see the techniques that are being used? So we spent over 10 years, really learning this, understanding it from like a red team aspect. And we started the hard way. We looked at the entire environment, network, applications, endpoints, firewalls, and use something called the MITRE ATT&CK framework to help us understand how all those attack vectors work. And if you look at the MITRE ATT&CK framework, you're like, oh my goodness, that's got hundreds of different vectors there, So we spent a lot of time, building basically an automated SIM to help us deal with that. But as we were doing that, we said, if you look at the endpoint, it's just a subset of those types of attacks that actually end up there. So why don't we build, an OT endpoint that has AI in it, like we were in our SIM, but we'll just use the AI in a different way. We'll just say we detect the attack, we verify it, and then we stop the attack. And then we tell you about it, right? Okay. So it's completely automated. So your report comes up and says, yep, you had, malware tried to launch here on this device. This is your alert. We stopped it. You've got to go do some action to clean it up. But at least now when you go back to the report, I was breached, and we took this action to respond. And we took it in, minutes, instead of 4 days or whatever that you're given in the SEC requirements. So that's how we did it. So, but again, then we looked at it and said, AI, there's challenges in this. This isn't easy, right? We said AI is going to have to work best if it's not generative AI, where I have to send this information up into a cloud and then figure out what the attack vector was, and then bring it down a couple of days later, maybe a week later. And well, wait a minute, not all these environments are attached to the cloud that way, right? They're still so we said, no, the AI is going to run distributed in every endpoint. Even those little XP endpoints that don't have a lot of processing power, we have to have a very restricted form of AI that'll run there and stop those attacks. So that's kind of our approach to it. Lots of patents around this because no one else was doing it. So I'm free to talk about it now. But those were the challenges we saw. And we said, we think this is the approach that'll work well with the constraints that OT environments have. So that, it'll work on the old stuff. You don't need internet connectivity. You get one load of software. It's up and running and protecting in minutes. You don't have to have trained staff. You don't need a 24/7 SOC team, even though we do provide one for you. If you say, wait a minute, I need to make sure this is monitored, and I want you to generate the reports and help me with this so I can prove compliance, we have that. We have people that will do the 24 hours. They're all U.S. citizens, by the way, because a lot of these people can't have this stuff going to India or places. So we try to think through all the angles to, think about your traditional OT environments, a lot of the constraints they have, because some of them are like, oh, wait a minute, I'm a federal contractor, right? And I have to have U.S. citizens, in my environment. So we try to think through all those different aspects of which the challenges are to create a solution that's really crafted for this space.
Well, I'm glad you brought up AI. That's obviously a huge conversation, huge talking point right now in cybersecurity. Why do you, from your perspective, from a good guy's perspective, we understand why the black hats like it and stuff like that. From a good guy's perspective, what makes AI such a great tool in terms of refining some of these cybersecurity tools or implementing it into a cybersecurity defense plan?
Yeah, big question there. So, like I said, we've had sort through a lot of AI approaches over the years. And the one we used on our SIM product is much different than what we're using in the endpoint product. So a lot of it is evolved. So what we looked at is, for our, you got to be fit to purpose, right? So you pick your AI to fit the problem you're trying to solve. Otherwise, you build a too expensive solution and you're paying for it in processing power that might not exist, on those endpoints, or reliance on some cloud somewhere that with an internet connection that's got infinite bandwidth that may not exist. So you got to figure out, which AI you're going to apply. So then in our case, we said, okay, it's got to be distributed, run independently at every endpoint. So the AI is going to be smart enough to know how to detect the attacks. So we basically had to pre-teach it, these are what the attack techniques look like. And they know that now you want the AI to detect and respond. You want it to say, I figured this out, and now I'm taking a decision, and then I'm pushing an action. In the past, we didn't trust it. We'd say, detect and tell us about it, right?
Okay.
Problem is, if you're telling somebody who's like, not there or is there twice a week, that's a long time, for someone to react to that. And then maybe now you've got all kinds of, alerts coming up. So the person's like, I can't figure this out, So I need AI on the back end to tell me what the devices were telling me. So we did that. No, we'll simplify it down so that we'll actually take the action and then tell you about it. So here's a list of attacks that were permeated. These are the devices that were impacted. No, we were the devices. We actually know the device group, the line that was running in. So that's impacted because, we're dealing with like pharmaceuticals. You may have to tell the FDA and they need to isolate it down, or also shut down your whole factory, right? So you don't want that. Say, yeah, I had a problem here. It was isolated. Here it is. You want to investigate it. Okay, you can shut this down, but don't shut the whole, COVID vaccine factory down like happened one, not too many. So that's the type of approach we use, is to have, simplified version of AI that will run distributed. Others will solve other problems, and you want generative AI, which will run in the cloud, because then you want to train it. You want to take advantage of a lot of learning from different sites and come back and, apply some cool stuff. So I'm not saying that's not acceptable. It's great for a lot of these IT solutions, but it's not as fast moving as people would like,
Sure.
It takes weeks to respond.
Well, and time is always of the essence. It's always critical, especially in cybersecurity, especially in manufacturing, for all the reasons we've talked about. When we talk about the way your AI works, I think that's really interesting. You said you're constantly teaching the AI how to respond to attacks, or how to detect different strategies, different tactics used by the hackers. We know they're constantly evolving and changing the way that they come at us. How does the AI keep pace with that? Is it simply as accessing the MITRE database that you mentioned? Is it a lot of manual input? How does that kind of function, if you could tell us a little bit more about that?
We've figured out all the typical attack techniques that are used.
Okay.
And those don't change as quickly as you would think. So all we have to do is know every type of attack technique that might be used by, typically it's programmatically controlled, attacks. It's not usually, some human coming in there and doing stuff, but that could be later in an attack. But so we're saying, okay, out of the MITRE ATT&CK framework, there's these 50 types of techniques, that would apply to applications on endpoints and OT. And they may be used in different combinations. They may be obfuscated. They may do this, but eventually, usually something happens, and what we patent on is that something usually happens in the memory of the device. So we see things like, hey, here's one, we've locked this down to these set of applications, verified that they come from these vendors, and we're not going to let anything else execute. So that's maybe a first step, like, hey, we're locking down to this version of Rockwell Automation on this device for this particular platform, meaning this OS. And that's all it's ever going to execute until someone relaxes that, and if someone tries to put a new update down and it hasn't been approved, we're going to block it until someone says, that's okay, go in there. So that's a manual method, but it's just locking it down. The AI comes in where, well, it's not that. We got the applications running, but something's trying to creep into memory, like an injection. You hear things like heap sprays, all these other forms of or function attacks where someone's trying to come in there and run a process inside a process, and it's obfuscated and it's trying to I'm going to run this process. I'm inside the industrial automation. We're all of a sudden saying, what the heck is this? This process doesn't belong here. our AI has already realized this is a normal set of processes. Boom, we're
Yeah.
not going to process off. We kept the main industrial automation application running. We just terminated that function and told it up. So there's really ways that people come in. They're usually coming in with like injections. They may be running scripts, so we can detect malicious scripts, or running these, processes. Or they'll come in, more from a nation state attacker, and they'll try to come in through the OS and then use the OS tools against itself. We can pick those up too. We can not only lock down the applications, we can lock down the OS, and we can see that these are not normal processes. So like one good example you see here is like living off the land attacks.
Mm-hmm.
That's like the most hidden, sophisticated set of combinations of techniques you'll see used. So we'll often demo that to people if they're willing to spend 20 minutes watching us go through.
Yeah.
What I do worry about is the speed of these attacks that are starting to appear. Because that's what overwhelms a lot of the traditional approaches that came out about 10 years ago, your typical endpoint detection response systems. They're still relying on shipping stuff up to the cloud and, weeks later coming by.
Yeah.
Some of these guys missed the Log4j vulnerability, right?
Wow.
The biggest ones out there, one of them missed it for six months before they had a way to stop it. And their excuse was, well, there should have been a patch for it. We can't stop everything, which is accurate. No one, I didn't promise I'll stop everything. No one can say they'll stop everything. So, I'm not taking them to task, but that's an example where, they missed it, and then finally they had it. But that was a long time, so you only need one of those to have a really, bad day, right?
Absolutely. Well, I'm sorry, go ahead.
I was saying the other ones are, if you go all the way back to SolarWinds, that's what perplexes a lot of these tools, because when that originally started, it came in with a legitimate certificate from SolarWinds. That just passed right by all these access control listing products, and they look fine, and then they missed the underlying what happened next. But that's where these what we call our countermeasures that the AI implement say, okay, yeah, this was legit. I let it execute because it was accepted. The additional measure said, oh, now there was this weird process that was trying to, inject, or the OS, what's going on? The OS is doing this. What is happening here? Because we saw it actually had permeated into the OS itself. Now there's weird calls going on or processes happening that normally don't happen. So that's the way in which, we're starting to solve these very, very difficult to detect attacks, and take them out before they're actually doing any harm.
No, it's interesting. In hearing you describe the way that the AI is positioned and the way that it works, it really feels like it's going after two of the bigger issues that we hear from manufacturers most frequently, which is visibility into the system. They can't see everything, and dwelling attacks, where people get in and they stay in there and they can't kick them out, even if they pay the ransom or adjust to whatever problems they were seeing initially. Is that the future? Do you think that's going to continue to move forward and get even better?
I assume, that that's better or worse, but the OT environments are seeing all the same attacks that the IT environments are now seeing, and we're saying the IT approach has got to change too, right? Yeah. So what we have today from the industry's best practices of having EDRs that can detect and stop things, in days, is not really good when days are actually weeks, right? And they have to see it somewhere, diagnose what's going on, and then say, okay, it's these set of behaviors. Now I'm going to inject a new IOC, indicator of compromise, into my EDR here, or next gen, AV, what do they call it? And now block that set of behaviors. But it might have, they had to see it first. And so one of their customers had to be, hit by it, and really, take them down. All of a sudden they get the export, they analyze it and bring it down. So the thinking there is, well, let's just automate in the cloud and use generative AI up there and try to speed up that process. And we're over here saying, well, that sounds good, but it doesn't work for OT because you're not always cloud connected. So there's that problem. Oh, and those guys expect you to have the latest and greatest OS on all your endpoints. Well, okay, there's another problem, and oh, by the way, they expect you to continuously patch, by the way, because ours isn't foolproof, so continuously patch. And the OT guys in manufacturing are like, help, I can't do that. I can't do that. I'd be in maintenance windows every week, and we would lose 20% of our our ability to manufacture, and that would be 20% hit to the revenue of the company, that type of thing. We expect to see more attacks more frequently. They're not going to be super sophisticated. They're just like, we'll just overwhelm you. You'll have so many attacks going on, and we'll just simply overwhelm your defenses. So you're whack-a-moling, and then something gets through and triggers. And I may have used my AI to learn from what you were whack-a-moling, what you had, so then I could launch the attack that I knew would succeed.
Yeah.
So that's the fear we have that'll be hitting the industry here over the next couple of years.
So even though the nature of the AI is to learn reactively, is essentially to the attack, is this still a way that we can get ahead of the hackers, of the bad guys out there using AI in these capacities?
Yeah. As long as you can figure out how the attackers attack, you can thwart them, and get ahead of them, right? Then be like, nothing's working, they'll move on, right? But you're taking out your traditional ransomware or malware, everything that's using some form of executable. We're very comfortable. We're going to stop that. And the more sophisticated attacks are using some form of injection processor. We take that out. There's very little surface for them to come in, at least at the endpoint or at the application level, to do any harm. I'm not saying about the network itself. They could still do DDoS attacks and have other networking level issues.
Sure.
But there's other great solutions out there that that we chose not to solve, because there's people out there that are doing a good job of that.
It's interesting. I think you're the first person in the almost 2 years I've been doing the podcast that has actually been able to say there is a way to get ahead of the hackers in some of these areas. So that's great to hear.
Yeah, well, like I say, it took us 10 years to figure it out. So we're just about coming up with it.
So are there right now, especially in the way that your platform works, are there any types of attacks or attack groups that are sort of on your radar, or that you've seen an uptick in, that are helping you to further enhance the solution?
They're always coming in. Yeah, I can't say it's a surge of one type or another. The supply chain attacks, scared the heck out of people. They're usually the ones that are very successful are usually somehow nation state backed. Let's just put it that way. So those are there. One of the ones that was very recent was the Move It for Progress software that IBM was distributing. And that was impacting a lot of environments. And that was the problem basically in July. That was really scaring the heck out of people.
Yeah.
But those plod along. You don't see as many. A lot of it is just this, constant worry about the malware and ransomware, leaking in, because there's just so much of it. And the thing about malware and ransomware that's changed from 10 years ago is you can't have a signature because it's constantly morphing the way it looks. So when you calculate the hash, it's always different. So you can't use those traditional techniques anymore. So now you've got to rely on, typically it's been the IOCs of the behavior of that. So, that's what scares people, right? So that's the garden variety. It's probably 80% of the attacks are still some form of, malware, ransomware involved, executables. So those are the things we got to do well, blocking and tackling. And then there's the more sophisticated, advanced persistent threats, kind of like you talked about. They'll come in, they'll try to dwell. They're sophisticated attackers that want to get purchase and then figure out what's in the environment, learn, and then try to go in and steal the stuff. So those are the ones that scare the heck out of you. They're often using the living off the land or other types of techniques we talked about. A little less rare, but they can be deadly, because they can take down your entire organization if you want. And we've seen that happen, right? So a little more rare, but they scare the heck out of the customers.
Well, and all those things seem to, again, point towards the benefits of an AI type solution that can continue to learn and develop and respond accordingly. Gary, we've talked about a ton of different stuff here. Any other trends that we haven't kind of gone over that you're seeing maybe playing a big role in the next year and a half?
Yeah, I would say it's the external trends. We started off a little bit there, is that for years, governments were pretty hands off in a lot of this. And it hasn't been until, really the last couple that things have gotten a whole lot better. So you're seeing, like I said, the Homeland Security, the TSA has set all kinds of rules on the airports, the railways. Actually, once in the airports, it probably trickles back to airplane manufacturers.
Mm-hmm.
It just starts to push outward. And then you've got Canada put it in a law saying any critical infrastructure, they name 7 of them. If these have breaches, you get fined. They're like $10 million fines. Well, maybe that's not a big deal to some places, but it's a lot. When I could be putting in $100,000 solutions a year, and to avoid a $10 million fine, maybe that starts to move people along. Australia has similar rules. And now I think the latest thing has been the other two areas. It's been we talk a lot to cyber insurers, and they're the ones like, hey, they were the ones that were legislating. You have to have, multi-factor authentication. You have to have some of these things that have to be in place. You have to have, these tests of your, penetration tests. Now they're starting to smarten up and say, you have to have some form of 24/7 monitoring of your endpoints. And they're not going to discern it or like that. Yeah, I got 90 of them over here in IT, but don't worry about these other 10%. They're firewalled off. They're not going to like, no, you don't. That was a negative. There was a no, so you don't get your renewal, right?
Right.
So people, oh, what? So I've got to go back and prove to them that I've actually got monitoring of those. In the same way, you look at the Homeland Security and all the other things, they ask me for the same thing. We want to see continuous monitoring of all those things, as well as continuous patching, but you need to monitor that. You layer in the SEC rules, would say, you got to tell us about breaches in 4 days if you're a public company, and you've got to file it into these reports. And then you got to tell us about what you did about them. And then you have also to tell material to the business. And you look at the rules, there's no squeaking by anymore. It's just like, hey, if an investor would have made a different decision to invest in your stock because he didn't know about this versus he did, that's material. So you have to report it. And then you have to say, well, what is your strategy and what are you doing? And how is your board involved with making sure that you have very sound security? So people aren't going to get off the hook anymore in these public companies. So I think it's going to change attitudes, for looking at solutions that aren't just quick checkoffs, saying, yep, I've got quick checkoffs here, for simple compliance. It's like, no, now I have to do meaningful solutions. And I should, because they should protect my organization and, help me sustain at least my top line.
So are you seeing a lot of this greater involvement by government agencies? This is a positive thing?
Yeah, I would say it is a positive thing. We thought for years that, the industry would do it, but the only place that we really saw the industry trying to drive change was, it was in utilities, with NERC, or some of the heavily regulated industries. Even the FDA is coming back in and, making their same type of rules, Department of Energy. So, I think this is a good thing, because I think it's going to change some of the behaviors, and it's going to raise the visibility where it needs to be at the levels of the organization. Where it's hard for a CFO to say, yeah, I really don't want to spend that right now because we need to make our numbers. Well, I'm on the hook here if we've got to report this, and eventually someone's scalp's getting nailed to the wall there by the SEC when they come back and start to dig into an investigation of your firm as to why you're having these problems.
Yeah, I agree with you 100% in terms of transparency, sort of driving accountability.
Yeah, that's a better way to say it. I like it. Transparent. I'm going to use that.
Thanks, Gary. And for more information on the work Arias Cybersecurity is up to, you can check them out at ariascybersecurity.com. Thank you for joining us today. And to catch up on past episodes, you can go to manufacturing.net, IEN.com, or mbtmag.com. You can also check Security Breach out wherever you get your podcasts, including Apple, Amazon, and Overcast. And if you have a cybersecurity story or topic that you'd like to have us explore on Security Breach, you can reach me at jeff@ien.com. For Gary Southwell, I'm Jeff Ranke, and this is Security Breach.